A pleasant day to everyone. Our group are going to present to you a new topic about scoring for ESP. But before we go further, let me present to you the objectives that we will undertake as we carry the lesson. So at the end of the discussion, the students must be able to, first, know the difference between test and evaluation. Second, know the ESP testing and its characteristics. And last, know ESP scoring and its two types. So for the short overview about the topic, at any time throughout a language course, it is necessary to evaluate students' performance at the beginning or at the end because it deals with the ability to accomplish certain communicative tasks. Learner assessment is very important in ESP. This lesson will identify the use of different tools in evaluating ESP as well as the types of scoring used in order to rate a particular output in the course. For the introduction, assessing and measuring students' success in learning languages for specific purposes is a debatable topic in teaching languages for specific purposes. So the reasons for applying assessment in teaching languages for specific purposes are perhaps best illustrated by one of the arguments that BOD 2007 provides when explaining the reasons for reframing assessment in higher education. So one of the most crucial parts of language teaching and learning is assessment. So assessment serves two purposes. The first one is summative assessments and the second one is this instructional feedback to help learners grow. BOD provided his explanation on why there should be changes in assessment in higher education. So, BOD proposes that assessment in the context of higher education should be reframed around the theme of informed judgment. When we pertains that assessment in higher education should be changed in the theme of informed judgment, it means that the learners in context of higher education should have the ability to make choices on their own. So according to him, assessments should be a mean in tracing data in order to gain evidence, perhaps in the improvements or changes that occurred in students' learning process. More so, to accurately assess the situations and circumstances in learning. Last is to draw conclusions to understand the information. According to BOD 2007, the purpose of assessments should be thus informing the capacity to evaluate evidence, appraise situations and circumstances astutely, to draw sound conclusions, and act in accordance with this analysis. So this is an idea that focuses on learning, centrally learning to form judgments as well as on the act of forming judgments about learning which might be used for validating purposes. This notion has the potential to incorporate a forward-looking dimension, informing judgment for future decision-making about learning. Evaluating an ESP course can help determine whether it is accomplishing its objective or not. The reason why ESP course should be evaluated is because it helps to identify if the set objectives were able to attain or not. If objectives were attained, there can be a measurable outcome if the course is effective or not. Course assessment also serves a social function by demonstrating all parties concerned, the teachers, students, sponsors, and so on, that their opinions are valued. These two types of evaluation aren't always mutually incompatible. Learner evaluations reflect not only the student's performance, but also, to some extent, the course success or lack thereof. The learner's evaluation is unlikely to identify the specific location of a problem, but it will at least reveal that one exists. Through the learner's evaluation, we cannot specifically determine the problem. However, it will still identify some of those.
Thank you, Mr. Mandia. At this juncture, I will be discussing tests, the three types of ESP assessment and evaluation. Let's proceed first to the test. What is a test? So in the slide, test is an instrument or tool that is used to gather a quantitative description of an observed phenomenon. Testing is the process through which tool is used. Meaning to say, test is formal and systematic instrument. It is usually in the paper and pencil procedure. It aims to assess the quality, ability, skill, or knowledge of the students by giving a set of questions in a uniform manner. So, there must be factors to consider when making a test. First is the validity. It is defined as the extent to which an assessment accurately measures what is intended to measure. Second, reliability. So it should be consistent and dependable. Lastly, practicality. So an effective test is practical. This means that it is not excessively expensive, it stays within appropriate time constraints, and its scoring procedure is specific and time efficient. Moving on, here are the three types of ESP assessment. So the first one is placement tests. The aim of placement tests is to determine the learner's state of knowledge before the ESP begins. So, when we say placement tests, it is designed to meet the needs of learners in the ESP courses. So, it is diagnostic because it measures how far and in what ways the learner falls short of the proficiency level. So, it is normally comes at the beginning of the course. So, placement tests can be in the form of reading tests, listening tests, quickly and sufficient reliable for group students, and short written exercises. So remember that in this placement test, it is concerned with the entry performance and typically focuses on the question, does the learner possess the knowledge and skills needed to begin the planned instruction? Second is the achievement tests. So it is the least problematic because it is usually internal to the course and does not have to conform to external influences. So generally, it is used to know how well the learner in keeping up with the syllabus and can be administered anytime through the course. So there are basic principles in constructing good ESP achievement tests according to Heaton 1975 and Ollier on 1979. So first, the form of test must be based on what the ESP teacher have taught to the learners. Second, the test must be measured what the ESP teacher want to test. And lastly, the test must avoid bias. For example, the test contains of specific cultural or religion knowledge. This test of course may result bias because every learner comes from different background of culture and religion. Last type of assessment is the proficiency test. So Davis and West on 1984 in the introduction to their guide to English language examinations identified the primary purpose of language testing in the 80s as proficiency testing designed to assess whether candidates will be able to perform the language tasks required of them. So simply, proficiency tests are used to know whether or not the student can cope up with the demands of a particular situation. For example, study at a university of reading technical manuals. So proficiency tests for a specific purpose should be able to give a reliable indication of whether a candidate is proficient enough to carry out the task that will be required. Jumping to the next and last discussion is for evaluation. What is an evaluation? Evaluation is the bigger umbrella term from which test and testing is included. Evaluation involves a qualitative judgment of how well a student has performed. Truly, evaluation consists of test and testing. It refers to judging the quality of what is good and what is desirable. To evaluate a student's works or to make judgments, criteria will be used. And for the next presenter, here is Miss Arlene Pascual.
The ESP ESP approach in testing is based on the analysis of learners' target language, use situations, and specialist knowledge of using English for real communication. English for specific purposes is specialized English language that teaching that aims to develop the specific skills of the learners in response to the needs identified or indicated by the various stakeholders. So this specificity includes equipping the learners with not only knowledge of a specific part of the English knowledge, but also competency in the skills required to use this language. So the tests enhance the learning process and act as a learning device, and particularly learning. ESP test is an aid to learning encompassing benefits such as reinforcement, confidence, building involvement, and building on strengths. So what really matters in ESP teaching is whatever the learners can communicate in a specific target language and use knowledge of the field in order to achieve their aims, in order to understand and be understood, in order to get their message across in English. So ESP tests are not exclusively employed to measure proficiency, but they may also be given to place students to check their progress. So the first one is performance-based testing, which is considered as the most useful and practical for ESP. So in constructing a performance test, a need analysis is conducted in order to provide a detailed description of the specific context and task which the learners will need to perform, the specific conditions under which this task will be performed, and the criteria against which the performance can be judged. So then, the learner's performance can be judged over a range of tasks that needs to be sampled using a variety of instruments and procedures. So the second one is testing in ESP focuses on the questions. Has the students reached the level that he or she supposed to reach? So there is no better way to know this but through simulated tests that compel the students to perform. So the main questions focusing in the ESP courses or testing is, does the students reach the level that he or she is intended to reach or to attain? This can only be assessed through simulated tests which compel the students to perform or give their best. So the third one is ESP tests are criterion reference because the students should reach a particular level in order to pass the course. So this is contrary or different to EGP or the English for General Purposes test, which are often norm reference. In ESP teaching or testing, there are criteria that can be used to assess if the students reach a particular level which is necessary for them to pass the course. So a criterion reference test is a style of test which uses test scores to generate a statement about the behavior that can be expected for a person with a particular score. So most of tests and quizzes that are written by the teachers can be considered as the criterion reference test or it is the standardized test. So one of the characteristics of criterion reference test is the subject mastery. So in this subject, the students are going to master the subjects or all the learnings in the subjects in order to advance to the next level. Moreover, the ESP tests are criterion reference tests being designed to represent the candidate's level of ability. Hence, his or her performance is interpreted with reference to the criterion judged to be essential for proficiency in a particular task. Thus, an ESP test calls for an interaction between the test taker's language ability and the specific purposes content knowledge on the one hand and the test of the other's results.
Moving on to the main characteristics of ESP tests. According to Dudley Evans and St. John in 1998 on page 211, from a more general perspective, tests are summative assessment tools and their goal is to evaluate student learning by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. in contrast with formative assessment instruments, which exhibit high degrees of flexibility. Most tests are conducted under supervision and require candidates to answer questions in a given time limit without reference to books or other people. Meaning to say, the examination are done under the observation of someone and require candidates to answer questions in a set amount of time without the use of books or other people. Moreover, the tests in ESP can be labeled as low stakes or high stakes, depending on their function. In a low stakes test, the results typically matter far more to an individual teacher or a student than to anyone else, and it is usually distributed, rated, and graded by the teacher personally. Whereas in a high stakes test, the test results are used to determine an important outcome having a major consequences or being the basis of a major decision. Some of the examples of low-stakes tests are mastery learning quizzing systems, in which students are able to repeatedly take quizzes on specific topics until they master the material. While in the high-stakes test, it includes college entrance examinations, high or secondary school exit examination, and professional licensing examination. Whereas, according to Cole and Osterline 2008, a low-stake test has no major effect or serious consequences for the test taker. A high-stakes test, on the other hand, has some academic or other serious consequences for the students. Another main characteristic of it is that the test gave more importance in identifying if learners can communicate in a specific target language and use knowledge of the field in order to achieve their aims, in order to understand and be understood, in order to get their message across in English. Another thing that really matters in ESP testing is whether learners can communicate in an ESP test are not exclusively employed to measure proficiency, but they may also be given to place students or to check their progress, a tool that will help to determine what students has been learned over a period of time and to summarize their progress relative to curriculum objectives. Moreover, IELTS or International English Language Testing System and TEEP or Test in English for Educational Purpose are two of the most widely used ESP tests, which provide items that shows possible academic scenarios that students will encounter when they join the academic environment. The ELTS is intended to give a fair and reliable evaluation of English language competency and to assist those who will work, study, or migrate to countries where English is the native language. This exam will measure the person's abilities to listen, read, write, and communicate in English, while TEP is a test of proficiency in English for academic purposes or EAP, which is intended to be taken by students whose first language is not English and who are planning to study at a UK university.
So now we will be moving on to the scoring for ESP. So scoring ESP is about how good or how can we say that a particular performance of the student is acceptable. So one vital issue to address in ESP testing is how performance is measured. Unlike the objective assessments such as the grammar test or performance-based examinations that have several problems. So one of these raters' tendency is to be biased and subjective. This problem prompted the creation of standardized scoring bands or what we so call the rubrics. So now moving on to the types of scoring, we have the holistic and analytic scoring. Holistic scoring evaluates the overall performance of a student. It results in a more general description for categories, but includes the different elements of writing implicity and explicity. The result is usually a global grade such as A, B, C, D, or E. So holistic scoring assigns a single score to an examinee based on the overall quality of the examinee's work or performance. So if you can still remember the previous lesson that we have on our assessment of learning course, holistic rubric assess the student's performance or output. It is evaluated by applying all the criteria simultaneously, thus providing a single score based on an overall judgment about the quality of students' work. It does not provide a score on each individual criterion, and one advantage of this holistic rubric is that it is quick to develop and used by the teachers. However, it does not inform the students about their specific strengths and weaknesses, and it may not be as sufficient and helpful in guiding them in providing their performance. So for example is rubric for problem-solving activities, which entails scoring the students' overall ability to solve a particular problem or issue, and rubric for creative work like painting and sculpture, which gives an overall score for students' creativity and skill. So now we will be moving on to the analytic rubric, in which it assesses the students' work by using each criterion separately, thus providing specific feedback about a student's performance or product along several dimensions. So this is most applicable for assessing a complex performance or product. So one advantage of this rubric is that it identifies the student's strengths and areas for improvement based on the criteria identified. So scoring with an analytic rubric, however, would entail more time than with a holistic rubric. So for example is the rubric for research paper that requires scoring a student's work on different parts of the research paper, or a rubric for chemical laboratory experiment taking into consideration the student's performance in every stage of the experiment. So here is an example of holistic rubric wherein we can observe here that the description of or the characteristics are being generally defined. It only assesses if the student's work or performance is well organized, or the statement is relevant to the topic, or if the work is focusing on the presentation of the topic. So here is another example, which is an analytic rubric that is being used in analytic scoring. So we can observe here that the criterion of this rubric is being specified, like the organization of the statement, the content, the delivery, and the use of media. So to generalize the topic that we have discussed, first we tackled about what a test is. It is an instrument or tool that is being used to gather the information needed by the teachers. Next is the evaluation, which is the bigger umbrella from which test and testing is included. Then we also discussed the ESP testing as well as its characteristic, and the scoring for ESP, which entails its two types, which are the holistic and analytic scoring. So that concludes our report. Thank you for listening.